There are many different types of material that are typically labeled compost, but they can have very different qualities and uses. I use quite a few of them within all of the different growing spaces I manage and explorations that I've been doing. And this has all become a bit confusing now that I've started to work with other people within the Black Plot Collective. We don't have one big pile of compost that we use for everything, which I think is what a lot of people would expect. Instead, we are currently using 9 different types of mixes of material for different uses and purposes, all of which we could refer to as compost, and often do. I do need to work on the naming of all of these, and although it would be useful to reduce the number, there could easily be more. The most obvious form of compost that we use is the decomposed remains of all of the old plants from the gardens mixed in with material from the surrounding landscape, food scraps from the kitchen, cardboard, and other biodegradable material. This is what is classically referred to as compost, or a compost pile, that slowly decomposes to produce that beautiful, crumbly brown material that most people would think of when talking about compost. I try to refer to this as general compost, and I don't have a very refined method for making it. I tend to just gradually add things to a bin, turn them occasionally, wait until it is mostly decomposed, and then sieve it before using it in the gardens. So there is variable quality and levels of fertility in the different batches depending on what the origin material was and the time of the year. But I tend to use the different batches interchangeably, hoping that each one was good enough, having started with a decent mix of organic matter without too much high carbon material. I tend to use a lot of this general compost as a soil amendment to add carbon, nutrients, and life to the soil with a bit of food for the plants. This spring we have mostly been using this type of compost to dig into the soil before transplanting the tomatoes and other larger plants, to improve the soil immediately around the plant roots. We have also been using it as one of the ingredients in some of the other growing medium mixes. I have gotten into the habit of adding additional amendments whenever I use this basic compost, usually adding an additional source of nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as seaweed and gypsum. I have learned through soil testing that our soils can be reasonably deficient in some of these nutrients, and it's a good time to add more of these amendments when we're adding the compost to make sure that the plants might have everything that they need. More recently, I've been adding these concentrated amendments directly to this finished sifted general compost and mixing it in, as it makes it easier to simply add a scoop of the amended compost at each planting station. So we have a second pile or bag of this amended compost that we need to keep separate from the original general compost. I am also starting to add these amendments while building the compost piles, regularly adding a sprinkling of concentrates in between the layers, so that this fertility can be better incorporated into the finished compost. But this is something that I need to keep track of to remember which piles are amended compost and which piles are still the basic compost. The bags of material that I buy in for starting seeds, which I generally refer to as seed compost, but should probably be calling seed substrate or seed mix, is very different from this amended compost. It is a much more consistent material with smaller particle sizes, not a lot of nutrients, and devoid of the absence of biology that I would generally hope is in the amended compost that we use. It also doesn't contain any weed seeds, which is really useful. All of this makes it a better medium to use when sowing seeds, especially the tiny seeds that are often really slow to germinate. The tender seedlings can be affected by some of the biology in the compost, and some seeds don't germinate so well when the fertility is too high, and trying to locate our precious seedlings in amongst a flush of weed seedlings is not fun. But these bags of seed compost are consistent and easy to use and without a lot of the problems, produced by professionals for professional growers, and also fairly expensive. But I think it's definitely worth buying in bags of this material, which we use whenever we are starting smaller seedlings in trays, modules, or pots. I also buy in bags of potting mix or potting substrate, which I often refer to as potting compost. But it's not really compost, it's a growing medium, and I think it's important to make that distinction. This stuff is a mix of fairly inert organic material with larger particle size, with some form of fertility mixed in, and it's useful for filling pots, for sowing large seeds, or for transplanting larger seedlings. This is the kind of material that you could grow permanent potted plants in, but we mostly use it to help grow plants like tomatoes, peppers, and squash that need a bigger pot and root ball before being transplanted. This potting substrate is consistent, convenient, and professionally made, and also quite expensive, especially with all of the large plants that we are growing. There are other options, but they're generally made of peat, which I try to avoid when I can, so I pay the extra money to get this peat-free stuff shipped in. I also buy in bags of blocking compost or blocking medium from the same supplier. This stuff is specifically mixed for use when producing compressed blocks for propagating plants, which includes an appropriate mix of material that allows the blocks to hold together, with enough fertility to allow the seedlings to grow quite big. This is a really interesting and useful method of propagating plants, but I haven't been using it so much in the last few years for a few reasons. But I'd like to start making these soil blocks again, so I recently bought a few bags. It is, of course, possible to mix our own material for making these soil blocks, but buying in the bags means that everything is more consistent, easier to use, and more likely to be successful. So we have 3 different types of growing medium that we buy in plastic bags that unfortunately look very similar, but that we need to use the right one for the right situation, and thankfully the materials do look different. I also buy in a lot of larger ton bags or cubic meter bags of what I generally refer to as municipal compost. This stuff is made at a municipal or industrial scale and is a lot cheaper than the smaller plastic bags of growing medium. Thankfully, the supplier that I rely on produces a fairly consistent product, and I've never found any plastic or other problematic materials that seem to be in so many of the other forms of municipal compost that are around. It is generally made from a lot of woody material with just enough high nitrogen stuff mixed in to facilitate the original composting process, so the end result is quite high carbon and not fully decomposed. I've learned from experience that this type of municipal compost does not contain enough fertility or nutrients to grow plants, at least not without significant amendments. But it is very useful and convenient as a high carbon mulch on top of the soil of the growing beds, especially with the reduced tillage or no-dig methods that we are using for most of the larger growing spaces. A thick layer or mulch of this municipal compost produces a darker surface of the beds, which allows it to warm up faster, which is a good thing in Ireland. And because it is free of weed seeds, a thick enough layer can really reduce the amount of weeding that needs to be done. I have tried using this much less expensive material on its own as a substrate for microgreens and as a growing medium in pots, but that didn't work out very well. But we rely on this municipal compost quite a bit, as a convenient source of carbon, as a surface mulch on some of the growing beds, and we also add it to some of the other mixes that we make. I've also had quite good success with amending this municipal compost. When I get a delivery of these large bags, I sometimes transfer it from one bag into another, layering in a fair amount of concentrated soluble fertilizer. I add a lot of soluble nitrogen to balance out the high carbon material, as well as other nutrients that are generally deficient in our soils. And then I inoculate it with a biologically active compost slurry and let it sit for a while. This seems to transform this low fertility mulching compost into a high fertility feeding compost, which is much more useful in smaller quantities for feeding plants in the gardens. And I need to keep this more valuable, amended municipal compost separate from the other large bags of municipal compost, as it really is different stuff used for different purposes. We're also doing a lot of growing in large grow bags, which are filled with a lighter weight growing medium that I often call grow bag mix, that is reused and recharged year after year. This is a mix of different types of growing medium, including potting substrate, leaf mold, decomposed wood chip, and the municipal compost, as well as some general compost and other concentrated amendments. And then we mix in perlite and vermiculite, which helps with water retention and aeration of the material, as well as making everything a lot lighter so the bags are easier to move around. We have been producing and reusing a lot of this stuff to fill a lot of grow bags, and generally have a big pile of the stuff covered with a tarp ready to go. There is an issue with weed seeds, either from the general compost or from recycling the material itself, and I need to keep an eye on the levels of fertility available to the plants that are growing in these grow bag material for many months. Because we have so much of this grow bag mix, I started using it when potting up the larger plants that will eventually be transplanted into the garden beds, to avoid using so many bags of the potting substrate that I have to buy in. But then I realized that all of the perlite and vermiculite was ending up in the soil of the garden beds. This isn't necessarily a problem, but it's not the best use of a fairly expensive material that I have to buy in. So we started to create our own potting mix, which is essentially the grow bag mix without any perlite or vermiculite. It's still using a mix of general compost, recycled growing medium, and municipal compost, with appropriate amounts of concentrated amendments, so it's relatively inexpensive and easy to produce a lot of. It is also variable quality, but so far a lot of the larger plants that I've used it with seem to be happy, and I don't mind it ending up in the soil, but I still need to keep it separate from the grow bag mix. So, I have the general compost with various different piles on the go in different locations at one time. There are also versions of this general compost that are amended either before or after, and this needs to be kept separate and used for different purposes, which complicates things a bit. And then there are bags of seed substrate, potting substrate, and blocking substrate that I buy in, which I often refer to as seed compost, potting compost, and blocking compost, but I should try to stop that as it's confusing. And there is much larger quantities of municipal compost or mulching compost that I buy in, and the amended versions of the same material which needs to be kept separate. And then there are the two types of material that we mix ourselves, one as a permanent or long-term lightweight material to fill pots and grow bags, and the other a cheaper potting mix for use to grow larger plants that will end up being transplanted into the soil. So that is 9 different forms of material that we're using at the moment, all of which could be called compost, and we often do, which can get confusing, especially with so many different people working in the different growing spaces. It is possible to reduce the number that we need to keep track of. I plan to always amend the general compost as it is being assembled and to amend all of the municipal compost as soon as it gets delivered. So that will reduce some of the overlap and confusion. And if I can consistently produce good quality potting mix of our own, then I might stop buying in any of the bags of potting substrate. So that could reduce the list to 6. But I also want to try a lot of other things. I've started a worm compost bin, and the worm castings will be a very different material. I also want to get hens again and use them in the composting process, which will create a manure amended compost material. And I also want to try a bioreactor and other methods such as KNF to produce a much more biologically active compost. And I want to start collecting more leaf mold and wood chip for decomposing into other high carbon material. So things are likely to get more confusing with more piles and containers of different materials to keep track of, but that's for a future date. For now, all of the people working in the gardens, including myself, need to only deal with the possible confusion between 9 different materials, all of which can be called compost. People who have been following my channel for a while might have noticed that I haven't done an epilogue or outro like this in a while. I've also not produced so many longer format videos like this, and have been focusing a lot more on the shorter content on YouTube and on TikTok and Instagram. I hope to do a lot more of these longer videos in the near future, but it's been a very busy spring. The world outside is very distracting and worrying, and I'm trying to figure out how my project and my videos fits within all of that. Like so many people, we're also dealing with our own things in our own private life. But probably the most distracting thing for me is the fact that I've started a brand new enterprise that we're calling the Black Plot Collective. It's a very interesting and exciting collaborative growing project that is based mostly in the black plot and is occupying a lot of my time. But once we're through the initial setup stage and the busyness of the spring, we should have a lot more time for all the other explorations. If you like the content that I have been making and interested in this new direction, make sure to subscribe. And for those of you who really value the work that I do and have a bit of extra cash around, please consider becoming a patron or supporting the channel through PayPal. The links to both are in the description below. But most importantly, thank you for watching.